Trial number 3. Let's see what this does.
Are we live?
Yeah, I don't think there's anyone here, but we're live.
Okay.
And if you have the Slido app on your phone, I can just...
Is it live stream 3 now?
Yeah, I didn't give it a number, just it'll be the only one on the page.
So you've got a battery backup there?
Yes. Yep.
No.
You live stream rolling.
Was it popping up telling you people were joining?
CFC
Yes.
live tour is working. Think we have someone, maybe?
Well, it was working, and then it stopped working.
Yeah, what time was that
Yeah,
at?
you'll see right there. See
Oh, 2 people. Hey, people.
Okay. I'm in. We at least have Jay. Jay is here. Hi, Jay.
Where's Jay from?
Oregon.
The 3 people that got to enjoy that. Okay, 5. This is good, and we haven't crashed yet.
Can we do some test of sound to see how Kyle and or I or Lane sound from this distance? Can folks hear me?
I'm guessing from the test I did earlier when you guys were talking, and then I played it back, that that's going to be pretty quiet.
Yeah, from last year, you're gonna wanna.
And you may want to get closer too, Kate.
Oh yeah, I wanna.
Let's not get.
I figured we could swap if you wanted.
Okay.
It's if you want, because you wanted to. I'm comfortable with that. If you wanna, I know you wanted to do it, and I'm pretty indifferent. So
Yeah.
I wasn't planning it. Just give me Slido.
You're not doing the thing again.
No.
All right, everybody. So I see 17 people which is awesome. I hope you're hearing us okay. So let us know through Slido. I'm sure you can hear me shouting from the phone in my hand. But Marcella and Kyle, why don't you say a few words, and then folks can let us know through Slido, please, if you can hear them well enough. I'm going to move a little closer. Go ahead.
Welcome to the Cloquet Forest.
We are in a red pine stand. Folks can see, hopefully, red pine, and folks can't see maybe the raspberries that Eli is standing.
No, there are no raspberries. You're not missing anything, people.
We ate them all.
That's Lane Johnson.
And then the other part that's wonderful is the sweet fern. So
Yes.
to me, it smells like fruity pebbles. So.
All right, so 26 people online. It's a few minutes after 10. So I think we're ready to probably get started. Those of you online, go ahead and do let us know if there's anything we need to know about audio, if we're too quiet, or if I'm making you nauseous by panning too quickly or whatever. Let us know that through Slido. And so Kyle and Marcella.
Wine tasting right now.
Yeah, that's right. So I think we're ready. Do you two want to kick us off?
Yeah, I can introduce Kyle. So welcome, and it's awesome to have you all here virtually. We're looking forward to sharing some of what we have at the Cloquet Forestry Center. And to do that, first is Kyle Gill, who is the forest manager at the Cloquet Forestry Center. And I'm going to let Kyle do the rest of that introduction because he's got a great story to tell. And you get to hear enough from me many, many days.
Yell loud.
Yell? Okay. Kyle Gill, CFC, Cloquet Forest Manager.
And I'll move closer too.
Yeah, welcome. Eli, 6 feet, please. Welcome to the University of Minnesota Cloquet Forestry Center. I'm Kyle Gill. As Marcella said, I'm the forest manager and research coordinator here. So basically, I feel like my job is to make sure the land can provide the education and spaces for education, research, and outreach that the university wants for it. So we've been here, the university has been here since 1909, and it's really important to know that we're on tribal land. So not only are we within the 1854 treaty area of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, the Fond du Lac Band and the Ojibwe people, but we're within the reservation boundaries, which adds an interesting layer, I'd say, to how we approach land stewardship here. If you want to learn more about how the university came into, or how the land came into university stewardship back in 1909, you can look at the Camp 8 story. The short of it is that in 1889, the Nelson Act was the Minnesota specific act, similar to the Dawes Act, that basically broke up reservations and was the allotment period in Minnesota. And at that time, the head of the new forestry program at the University of Minnesota was looking for land to have an experimental and research forest. And he wanted it in representative land in the state, representative timberland, and also near markets. So we're in Cloquet, or about 5 miles away from downtown Cloquet, which is known as Pine City, USA. I think at the turn of the century, 1800s and 1900s, we had at least 3 mills. There may have been more. The Weyerhausers were involved here, and other companies that I think we all kind of know. Now our main mill is Sappi, and they're mostly taking in aspen, so they're not working in red pine as much anymore, though they do a little bit of it. But he wanted that proximity to mills, he wanted a representative forest, and he wanted to demonstrate what long-term forest stewardship looked like. And so that's the basically what we've been doing here for the last 110 years, is exploring what does long-term stewardship of the land look like, and how do we do this thing called forestry, which was new at that time. So the way we do it is through a combination of making sure we have land that's available for research, and then and also doing active management. So we're in a stand here that balances a little bit of both of those. So we're in what we call the stand 57. 57 is just the polygon number in our veg layer, and it's about a 12-acre stand that was regenerated in the I want to say 1930s, 1940s, and our records aren't totally clear if it was natural regeneration or planted. We have plantings that go back all the way to post cutover. So when we initially the land was donated to us by those mills, they retained the rights to harvest a majority of the timber. And so a lot of the red pine we have here was actually naturally regenerated following that initial cutover in 1910. And I think this maybe came in about 20 years later, or the trees that are now here.
And Kyle, since not everyone's from here, you're going to tell us about the species?
Oh, sure. So we're in a FDN 33 native plant community, and that can express itself in a lot of different ways. It tends to be, FD stands for fire dependent. We're in the northern floristic region, and there's it's often I think it's a dry mesic mixed woodland. And so that can be expressed with primarily pine in the overstory or primarily aspen birch in the overstory. So here we're seeing, in the overstory, we're seeing primarily red pine. And in the understory right now, so we're only a few years after harvest, so I'll get into that, but we're seeing primarily beaked hazelnut and sweet fern and raspberry, red raspberry. And there's bracken fern, and there's some grasses as well. I want to say false melic grass, which is a typical FDN 33 grass species. There's some blueberry. There's some aspen as well. So we're seeing what we would expect to see in an FDN 33 dry mesic mixed woodland. So the canopy species is red pine. And that, I think you all have been learning about a little bit from a physiological standpoint. And so we try and take that like hopefully we're all doing, we're taking that science and trying to apply it in a stand like this, and trying to do things that make scientific and operational sense. So in this stand in particular, it was in we do a 10-year management plan. We're tree farm certified, and so we do a 10-year management plan, and we tend to target, when we set up the stands that we're going to treat, we tend to target treating about 1% of the land per year, so that then in theory the land gets turned over in about 100 years. And that's not totally the way it ends up working out, because about 2/3 of our land base, which is about 3,400 acres or 5 square miles, about 2/3 of that is an upland forest, which obviously are going to get turned over a lot more quickly than the 1/3, which are lowland forest. And here the lowland forests tend to be dominated by black spruce and tamarack mostly. And our uplands tend to be dominated by red pine and aspen and some pockets of white pine and jack pine. Kind of depends on where they're at in their management schedule. So in the uplands though, so this stand 57, was in our management plan as being due for treatment in this 10-year cycle. And so we had the opportunity, because there's so much going on about research-wise regarding how to talk over planes that are flying overhead.
There's an airport right next door.
Yeah.
Kyle, while we're pausing for that plane, I'm going to go over here and I can orient people to a couple more species, at least from a distant view of the canopy. But if I can hold this steady and zoom in, you can see a nice white pine crown there, a couple of them over in the distance. And most of this stand, as Kyle said, is composed of red pine, most of the overstory. And you saw me zooming in a little bit, but I'll go back to it. So here's some of that beaked hazel that Kyle pointed out, pretty short, 4 feet tall or so in the understory after this harvest. And I showed you a couple of those other species too. All right, Kyle, thanks for pausing.
So we had the opportunity. There's a lot going on at the research level in terms of how to do silviculture, how to do adaptive silviculture for climate change. And a lot of those projects are operational in scale, but we wanted to try and take some of the lessons that they're learning and the theory that's going on and actually apply it locally to this stand to see if we could basically translate from a research perspective into an operational perspective. So our primary goal, when we came into the stand, knowing that we wanted to do something that was an example of adaptive silviculture, we used the resistance, resilience, and transition framework that hopefully you're all aware of.
Yesterday.
And Marcella says yes. So we were thinking within that framework and using the NIACS, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, guide for adaptive silviculture for the Great Lakes region in Minnesota in particular. And so when we looked at this was, I think the basal area of this stand was about 93%, if I remember correctly, plus or minus a couple percentage points. The basal area is primarily red pine. And so when you look at the what they recommend in terms of diversification or diversity of overstory trees and trying to set up your stand for resilience, we were not in a good spot in terms of setting up a resilient stand. So one of our first things that we knew we wanted to do was to try and diversify the composition in order to increase resilience. We knew that we didn't have to put it, this system isn't rare enough that we needed to put it into a resistance category. So if we had been in something like a northern white cedar stand, then maybe we would have considered doing a resistance treatment. But here we said, we know we've got room to play with because of the amount of red pine that we have on and FDN 33 that we have on our landscape. Let's try some things out. We didn't also want to go to the full transition because I think when we're doing a demonstration of what we think foresters might want to do, I don't think a majority of us are going to say, hey, you should totally throw out the last 100 years of what we understand in terms of how to manage these systems and try something totally new. We do that in some other spots, but we didn't feel the need to do that here in this stand. So as a demonstration, we basically wanted to say, we wanted to answer the questions of what can we do that we think we could say to the average forester here in Carlton or St. Louis County. Here's something we think you could try with some of your own tweaks if you come across a red pine stand that you want to do adaptive silviculture. So when it came to the broader goals in the workbook, we understood that we wanted to have two primary goals, and that was to diversify the composition. So we knew we were a little bit undiversified because it was so much red pine. And we also wanted to diversify the structure. So both the vertical and horizontal arrangement of the trees, because we had a very even structure as well. It was even age, kind of classic timber production forestry stand. It was even age red pine. All the trees are basically, they're very low coefficient of variation in terms of the basal area across the site as well as the size of the trees. And so when we're thinking about ways to increase resilience in the stand, we said we want to diversify the composition, both of the trees and the understory, as well as the structure. And we felt like if we diversified the structure, we were going to inherently get some of that compositional diversification as well. So those are the two primary goals. And the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change project over on the Chippewa National Forest used clear-cut, I'm pretty sure they used clear-cut gaps, right?
A few different things.
They used,
Yeah.
they used I think in the resilience treatment though, they had been talking about gaps. And we've been talking, in Minnesota, we've talked a lot about using gaps in silviculture. If we're not gonna do a full clear-cut and regenerate, then we're trending towards using gaps. The initial proposal gap size here was 1/4 acre. And some of the stuff I had read, and I can't remember the exact references, suggested that 1/4 acre wasn't really big enough to get full sunlight conditions, especially when you're dealing with 80 to 90 foot tall trees. And so I ended up increasing that. I wanted to we're working on a 12-acre site, and we wanted about half of it in relatively open conditions and half in matrix conditions. And so I just took that 1/4 acre gap size and increased it to 1/2 acre. And decided to put 6 of those in here. So we're working with pretty good light diversity in order to diversify the composition and structure.
And I'm just trying to give you a sense for what that 1/2 acre, you've all, I'm sure, seen them before, but you know what that looks like with trees of this, the size that we're dealing with here and so on. So this is looking into one of those 1/2 acre gaps. There's Caitlin.
If we had had a bigger stand to work with, we might have tried multiple gap sizes, but for consistency, we just went with the 1/2 acre gap. Plus, it was super easy to lay out for our timber sale because we basically just put a plot center, and I think it was 83.4 feet or roughly 80 feet is the radius for a 1/2 acre clear cut gap. And we just said, okay, cut to the operator, cut everything that's within this gap. And that seemed to work out pretty well. And then we knew we still had pretty high density. I think it was over 300 trees per acre, which for red pine is higher than you really want for good crown structure and tree health. So we knew we needed to thin out the matrix as well. And so we targeted, I think it was about 110 square feet of basal area was our target retention in the matrix area. So basically any space that wasn't dedicated to a clear cut gap, we put into matrix. So we wanted to thin those trees out so that we could increase the size of the crowns. And knowing that if you have a really high population density or high tree density, your red pine has the ability to stay living a long time, but it's not necessarily living well. Their crowns just get smaller and smaller, and I call them poodle tails because they basically look like a buzzed off poodle tail with the big a little puff ball on top. And Marcel and I were commenting as we were walking through the stand that it's surprising how much more full the crowns look already, just from last year to this year. So we did the same tour last year, and they were noticeably just kind of small. And they don't feel noticeably small anymore. So hopefully the last few years of living in a reduced density has been good for the crown health of these trees.
Just trying to give you a view of some of that thinned matrix and some of the crowns that Kyle is talking about.
Yeah. So we're going after a basically when we're thinking just about the trees and potential future harvest, we're going for a 2-age stand here. So in the matrix, we've got this cohort that we're retaining of now 80-year-old red pines, and we're getting another generation started. And in theory, we might be able to start alternating coming in and thinning these and maybe doing a first thinning on the younger generation, and then going towards having what's now the younger generation be the retention in a future regeneration harvest. So that's kind of what we're going for from a timber production standpoint. We knew that, so like I said before, a majority of our trees were red pine, so we knew we didn't have a lot of seed source for diversifying the tree composition. So we knew we figured we need to plant, and so we then went back to the guidelines for adaptive forestry, and started to make some decisions about what we wanted to plant. And so we decided that we wanted to try both conifers and hardwoods, and we came to a decision that we wanted to use the Tree Atlas tree suitability predictions and choose one species from each of those broadleaf and conifer groups that was predicted to improve in importance value, one that was predicted to either be the same or be negatively impacted over the next 50 to 100 years, and one that was novel to the system. And so again, I said we're in an FDN 33 system, and there's certain species that are expected in the system and certain species that aren't expected in this system. And so through discussion with collaborators, we decided that for the conifer species, we went white pine is the tree that's predicted or modeled to improve in importance value. Jack pine is predicted to have kind of level, if not slightly negative importance value. And then we decided we were talking about potentially doing ponderosa pine as our novel species, but when I gave tours in this site, we got a lot of just questioning looks and kickback basically from the foresters and other people that were coming through here, like, why would you do that? It doesn't really make sense. And so listening to that feedback, I could rationalize experimentally using ponderosa pine. That's one of the species they're trying on the chip. And but again, returning to that roots of saying this is a demonstration, am I going to recommend to people, the average forester, that they're going to try ponderosa pine? No. So then we went back to something that was a conifer that was novel in the system, that historically occurred in both uplands and lowlands, but hasn't been in the uplands much due to larch sawfly, and also heavily harvested in the late 1800s was eastern tamarack. And so those were our three conifers. And for the hardwoods, the species that's suggested to improve is northern red oak. The species that is suggested to be negatively impacted is paper birch. And the species that's novel, that's not in the system, is bur oak. And that surprised us a little bit when we're looking at the expected community composition of this plant community. We know bur oak occurs around here, but it doesn't actually show up in the data when looking at FDN 33 expected community composition. So we thought that intentional planting would help us out in terms of increasing the diversity of the tree species. We did in the stand, we had some white pine in the canopy. We made sure to retain as many of those as possible in the harvest because this was a late growing season, early frozen ground harvest with full tree skidding. We expect with full tree skidding in this region that we're going to get some passive scarification. And so species like red pine, white pine, jack pine, paper birch all do well if you're able to scarify the soil a little bit, get rid of the duff layer. They tend to come in relatively well. And so we knew that we wanted a little bit of natural regen to support the artificial regen that we were going to do. So we ended up planting, we planted last year. It was hot and dry. We ended up using, in order to get graduate students and other students outside, because they had been cooped up already for a couple months due to COVID, we decided to use an in-house planting crew, and it's pretty different across a 12-acre site. I think an operational planting crew would have gotten it done in a couple hours. It took us a few days, and it'll be interesting to see how that impacts survivorship and mortality. It was hot. We had a hot and dry summer last year, and now we're in a top 5 historic for Minnesota drought. And so these seedlings are facing some tough times. They're really having to make it through. So what Eli's zooming in on now is one of those novel conifer species for this system. That's an eastern larch, Larynx Arsenia. And that historically, what's interesting about our public land survey in the 1800s is that was the most used tree. So in theory, that was the most represented tree. There's probably some caveats there as to why they chose those.
As a bearing tree or witness
bearing
tree, yeah.
Yeah, so we had a lot of representation of larch. They got used for mine shafts and railroads, and really heavily harvested in the uplands in particular in the 1800s.
And this was our only plug, our only containerized.
Jack pine was
jack pine?
containerized.
Okay.
All of them are actually bare root except for jack pine.
Okay.
Yeah. So there was either 1.0 or 2.0 stock, so pretty young. We did do, I gave this stand a rest period, so for a couple of reasons. So my background is in dendrochronology, and I've read a lot of stuff, both my work putting together historical stand development in jack pine systems, which are closely related to our red pine systems of the FDN 33, and looking from longleaf pine systems as well as Douglas fir and elsewhere. You tend to see when you reconstruct the even age stands, sometimes we'll have a break between a disturbance and when you actually see regeneration happening. And so I was okay watching the stand. We know that I was okay watching this stand for a couple years to see how the competition layer, the surface layer, developed for a couple years before making a planting decision, or before actually planting in. And we can have an issue with beaked hazel as being a really heavy competitor and a really heavy shade layer in our systems around here. And so I wanted to give that a chance to express itself and then knock it back, so that then I didn't have to do the, basically I didn't want to have to knock it back once we had already planted. And so we ended up, we had pretty high foliage cover from hazel and raspberry and some other species. And so we just took a brush mower and actually mowed down a majority of the surface layer the year prior to planting. And that made planting quite easy. And now we have that competitive layer back again, but I know that last year it was a little bit reduced, and so I'm feeling okay with how it is now.
So Kyle,
not being too much competition.
can you remind us of the chronology? So harvest, when was the harvest, and how much was it? Just 1 year of a break for the stand before you, or more?
Harvest was November 2016 is when they got started. So November, December 2016. And then we actually waited, we gave it 2017, 18, and 19 as the rest period. We knocked back the shrub layer in 2019 and then planted spring 2020. So now they've had one growing season there, and they're halfway through their second growing season.
Great. And I wonder if we ought to pause for questions,
I
or
was going to just suggest that maybe we pause and then we can mosey over to the...
Talk about herbivory.
Yeah. Okay, so Diplodia, Kyle. Are you concerned about that?
So part of the reason
what's Diplodia? Yeah.
Diplodia is one of the two shoot blight fungi that we see around here. So Diplodia and Syricoccus, they both show up as shoot blight, and this is the shoot of a young red pine that dies. So yeah, shoot blight is definitely an issue across here. That's why we didn't target red pine as one of the reasons we didn't target red pine as one of our primary regeneration species, because we aren't planning on taking this overwood off within the next 5 years. So I have another treatment, natural regen treatment for red pine, where I've really thought about shoot blight as an issue, and that has that's going to have a different sequence of overstory removal. But because we knew we already had good representation of red pine and the potential for shoot blight mortality in the seedlings, we weren't necessarily targeting red pine as one of the main regenerative species. Although I'm not going to kill it if it shows up.
And there's some nice ones.
And yeah, there's a decent amount of red pine natural regen coming in. And it'll be interesting to watch it over time to see how those are impacted by having this overwood still on. So the way the fungus passes is basically if it's either if it rains or if there's high moisture, the spores come from, they can hang out in the canopies of these red pine because there's so many shoots. And where they become an issue for mortality is if they infect the 1 to 5 shoots of a seedling. So there's just so many fewer shoots that the likelihood that a high percentage of the shoots are impacted is, if it gets in there, that causes mortality in those seedlings.
So diplodia doesn't typically wipe out red pine, but it can really reduce stocking of regeneration, and it can be a big, a big deal.
Maybe let's talk about slash, and then also let's talk about site prep. And there's a question of like, well, is it realistic what we're doing here in terms of both waiting and letting the stand rest or express itself, and then also the pre-planting vegetation control or vegetation management?
Okay, so yeah, slash, around here in our winter harvest, we tend to have a lot of breakage. If it's frozen, even if the ground isn't totally frozen, we tend to have a lot of breakage. So we tend to get a decent amount of slash buildup in our harvests when it's during the winter. And we didn't do any major specific slash treatments. So we had no specific, like we didn't do a full biomass retention or full biomass removal. So they basically treated it as they treat most of their red pine stands, which is when they take it to go to the delimber, they end up with this big pile of slash, but usually what they do is they redistribute around the stand. And so that's what they ended up doing here. The operators do like to put little wildlife houses together, and without, because I was fine with that, although they didn't ask me. So I was a little bit annoyed because I didn't necessarily want these wildlife houses showing up, because that impacted our how we could plant the site. But it's a pretty small percentage of the land base, and it's not bad to have a couple of slash piles here and there that the rabbits and other things can utilize. So the rest period I was totally okay with, because my goal here, my objective here is not necessarily strictly timber production. That's objective number probably 3. So objective number 1 is to put a demonstration of what I think is reasonable for something. If climate adaptation is a primary objective, which it was for us in this stand, or climate resilience, then that means that I have a little bit of wiggle room in terms of what I do, because timber production is maybe number 3 on the list. So that's why I was okay.
But that's not the questions for other organizations too, right? I've heard like counties will give their stand a 1-year rest period sometimes.
Okay, cool.
So like I've heard like St. Louis County sometimes does a 1-year rest period. So
good. So for our tree farm certification, we don't have, I think some of the other certifiers in Minnesota, all state lands and a majority of county lands are certified by either FSC, SFI, maybe both. I think they're dropping one of them, but a lot of the requirements are that they have to get it back to full stocking within 5 years. And so we don't have that as part of our certification of through tree farm that we've set up for. That we don't have that as a limitation or a possibility. So sometimes that's nice, because it really forces people to work hard to get their stocking high within 5 years. But I think here in a system like this, where historically there's some evidence that says, you know, sometimes it takes a little bit of time to get back to full stocking, then I was totally fine with waiting a few years. So is it reasonable to do across other lands? I think potentially. It depends on if they would have to get a variance for their certification. I would think if there's if it's a decision that's based in some sort of scientific proof, I think it could be argued for. I'm not totally sure if it's reasonable for everybody, but it was reasonable for us, and I think there's enough justification in the literature of allowing it to happen that it could be reasonable for others. And it did give us a chance then to come in and do some pre-planting competition reduction, which that might be the biggest sell, is to say, hey, we can just basically use larger equipment because we don't have to worry about the seedlings that we've already put money into, because we haven't put that money into those yet. Instead, we came back and knocked back the competition, and then put our money into the planting.
That's what I've heard the counties or some other organizations say, is that allows it to then just get everything up, especially when we talk about aspen. And some folks from the West, if you remember back, aspen here can be one of those competing vegetation species that we're not necessarily trying to regenerate. And so allowing that year to express itself and then doing something midsummer can then control that. So
Yeah, or at least reduce it to give your planted seedlings a chance. That's what, in a nearby stand here, if we cut one aspen, we get 10,000 back. It's a pretty awesome return ratio when you want to do aspen natural regen, but when you're not trying to do aspen natural regen, it becomes an issue.
can you say that again, just so folks in the West can like have their jaws completely
Yeah, no,
drop?
unless people, I think potentially you need to try cutting more of your aspen to see if it comes back, because we don't see it regenerating under itself here. We see it regenerating when the mature tree gets cut. We see basically, I call it a 10,000 to 1. I don't know the actual numbers, but a return ratio of 10,000 to 1. And not all of those make it to the overstory layer, but what I've started to do in my prescriptions, if I don't want to have to compete with that aspen, I actually say no cut on the mature aspen, because otherwise it becomes a nuisance basically. We have a number of stands in our diversified forest cover portfolio that are aspen, so there I'm going to take advantage of that. But in these other systems where I don't want it, then I need to figure out how to plan against it basically. And to me, like, so we're talking about an example of within stand resilience to climate change, and so that's at the stand level. I think what's important about our overall plan is that we have and why I want to keep aspen back in some spots is that when we look at the landscape level, our land base, we want to make sure that we have diversity at that level. And so I don't need aspen everywhere. I don't need red pine everywhere. I need some here, I need some there, and I also want them at little bit different age classes throughout the forest as well. So I'm gonna do red pine timber production prescription some places, but I don't need to do them everywhere, which gives us the freedom to try something like this that is a bit more experimental in practice.
Yeah, do we want to walk over to our
So as we're walking, I'll talk about another layer in this prescription. When we think about getting trees regenerated here in Minnesota, one of the things we really have to be concerned with or have to mitigate against is our white-tailed deer. So they tend to really go after hardwood species as well as the pines. So not so much spruce and fir or anything, or those conifers, but definitely the pines and definitely oaks can get hammered. And so we were working with our colleague Matt Russell to also put a layer of herbivory protection into this treatment. And so there's a few different things that can happen in Minnesota. The most classic pine mitigation is bud capping. So we knew that for one of our herbivory protections, we wanted to do bud capping. So this is actually on a tamarack. But this is last year's bud cap and this year's shoot that came up out of the bud cap. It's basically just a piece of paper over the bud. We know physiologically if the bud on a pine gets eaten, they're terminal growers, and so if that gets nipped, then that tree won't grow from that stem anymore. So that's why this bud capping technique works really well, is it protects that terminal bud over the fall and winter during the dormant period. So we knew we wanted to try individual tree treatment as one of our herbivory protections, because that's generally when we're thinking about scale of herbivory protection, bud capping works really well on large areas. And something else that works well on smaller areas is actually doing fencing. And so that doesn't work as well in large areas because you have to monitor the fences. If a tree comes down on your fence, you need to basically get the fence back up pretty quickly. So St. John's Arboretum in Collegeville, Minnesota has done a lot of work on herbivory protection for their oaks. And they find that roughly, for them at least, if your stand or the area that you want to protect from herbivory is 2 acres or smaller, it can make a lot of sense to go with fencing. If it's 2 acres or larger, it makes more sense to think about what the individual tree treatment options are going to be. So we wanted to use both group protection through fencing. We wanted to use individual tree protection for the conifers it was bug capping. For the hardwoods we tried kind of like bug capping, but with the bug caps don't tend to stick onto the hardwoods that well. So we used balloons, rubber balloons, and to protect the terminal bud. And then we wanted a full control as well, so we could compare and contrast to a full control. Especially when working with the slightly novel species, it's like, well, we're not sure if we need to actually do any herbivory protection treatment. So that's the herbivory protection layer on top of the diversification of composition and structure in this demonstration stand. Any questions that are coming through?
Well, let's see. Okay, let's go back to a slightly older one, which I think we've got some experience with now. Wind throw. Talk me through, like, as the time has gone by, like how you've been feeling about that.
So I've been pretty nervous about wind throw, but we tend to get straight line wind events, which you can't really mitigate against because they tend to go through trees that are exposed or heavily exposed. But that's part of why you want strong crowns and strong boles and root systems that hold tree, thinking about tree health. Like, you don't want those poodle tails because if they get hit by the wind, they're probably going to fall over. Knowing that we had a really high density and some smaller crowns in here, that's why I 110, thinning down to 110 to 115 is actually a little bit higher than typical. You tend to go to about 80 to 90 BA for mature red pine. But I knew that we had some weak crown architecture here, so I wanted to make sure to buffer against that by being on the higher end of the recommendations in terms of basal area retention.
Kyle, I don't know if you've mentioned the pre-harvest basal area. What did you thin down from? Do you remember?
I want to say it was, I'm blanking. I want to say it was at least 180 square feet of basal area.
Wow.
So we needed to take out almost 50% of the overstory. Yeah, if I can look at my, I forgot to look at that.
Oh, we don't need exact numbers. I just thought that reference would be, yeah. So a very heavy thin, and that's why and you've already talked about crown architecture, why you were concerned about wind throw.
Yeah, so in winter 2017, we were having 3 days of heavy winds, and I was like, man, these stands that I harvested in 2016 are gonna be just on the ground. And luckily we haven't really seen much wind throw, so it was fun to come out here and look at it. Basically felt like you were underwater watching the kelp sway in the wind. So it was really intriguing. It was really intriguing. It was also a little bit nerve-wracking too, but a majority of the trees stayed with it. I think if this were to get hit by a heavy straight-lined wind, there's not much we can do. But I mean, part of the reason you thin is to try and improve the strength of the bole and the strength of the tree to be a little bit more resistant to events like that.
And maybe let's make sure we talk about harvest, like our system, since we did regenerate. Are we like making sure we got our terminal?
Oh my, yes. I used the wrong,
What was a matrix thinning?
Well, yes, thinning the matrix, and then
regenerating the gaps.
So just making sure we have our terminology right when we're
I don't know where this one would fall. Gaps of a 2-age gap regeneration system.
I think it would be one of those shelter woods, non-uniform shelter woods with residuals, with tending in the matrix. Maybe.
Yeah.
Or variable density harvesting.
Yeah, but it's still pretty even. I mean, it's variable across the whole stand. So within the matrix, we had a retention goal, but obviously then the variation comes with these clear-cut gaps.
Yep.
So it's maybe a variable density, because it was to a density of 0 and a density of about 100 square feet of basal area.
But there is, I mean, you lost variability within.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to happen. Like, I think that's still, when I think of variability, I like to use coefficient of variation, because I tend to see, if I use coefficient of variation, which then puts the standard deviation over the mean into a percentage rather than using the units that you're in, I tend to see an interesting break at about 30%. So if something, we like to talk about variability, and one of my questions is always, okay, how do we define it? Because I'm a silviculturist, so I want to define everything. And it's like, how do we define that metric? And so what I've started to explore coefficient of variation more, and I tend to see what feels relatively even is up to about 30 to 35% coefficient of variation, because we're never going to have it. These are natural systems, or these are systems that have inherent variability. And so when we call it even, I think when I was coming out of school, I was expecting it's going to be totally uniform. And then once you get out and you're actually working in real forests, it's like, oh, okay, uniformity has variability associated with it. And so I tend to see a 30 to 35% coefficient of variation as being relatively homogeneous. And anything above that, I usually don't see much between 30 and 60 actually. And I haven't done any formal investigations into this, but usually things jump up into 60 plus. And that's when I feel like I have sufficient variability or heterogeneity in my system. So the reason I kind of balked at calling this variable density is because the matrix, I would think, has, I haven't looked at it, but I would think it had a coefficient of variation of 30% or less. So in the matrix, even though there's some heterogeneity in there, I think on average for a treed system, it's relatively homogeneous. Although across the stand, then we have 0 retention, so it would be variable. A 2 density retention in some two density, not highly variable.
Well, I think that brings up the point of spatial scale, right?
Yeah.
And thinking about how we talk about some of these things. And some of you are working not only at the stand, but also at landscape. So thinking about how you describe certain things depends on that spatial scale. Yeah. And maybe one more area we can touch on before we head to our next stand.
And just so folks know, we're gonna go a few more minutes here, then we're gonna take a break as we go to our next stand. So you'll have an opportunity to get up and refill your coffee or do whatever you want to do, and then we'll have you rejoin the stream, I think. Rejoin a new stream.
You can manage his invasive species outside.
Yeah, Ben, you can take care of some gypsy moth caterpillars, right?
One of the things we were talking about before we started the stream was just how we think about vegetation and what we call different layers of vegetation, and based on which perspective we're thinking from.
Yeah.
And so I think that could be a really interesting part of the conversation too, Kyle.
Yeah, so I have been looking at, when I came into the stand to prep for this, I was a little bit surprised at how much ground cover we had already, because it seems way thicker than last year. But when I look at the species that are here, I'm actually okay with again, being a little bit patient. I think at times it's really easy to be like, I need to do something right now. And that's maybe part of the learning process of getting out in the field and learning how these systems work too. And what to expect in terms of stand development, and not just the tree stand, but in terms of the overall community composition. I'm okay, because I know sweet fern and raspberry, which are the 2 highest density species right now in this layer, in the ground surface layer, especially in the open. The matrix is still relatively open in the understory, but because I know those are historically a part of these and presently a part of these systems, I'm actually expecting them to not necessarily be as much competition as if it were totally covered with beaked hazel or aspen or something like that. I think they're community associates, and potentially, especially when thinking about drought resilience in this summer in particular, where we haven't had as severe of a drought as the rest of Minnesota, but we're definitely showing up on the Palmer Drought Severity Index as being in drought. They could actually have a facilitative effect of helping to reduce some of the moisture loss that we would otherwise see. And that's a trade. All things are trade-offs, right? So like maybe we want this site to dry out really quickly, and so we don't want to retain the moisture. But I think that little bit of moisture retention should be okay. But it'll be, I'm still learning about what I should expect to see in this first 5 to 10 years of stand development in real time, because when we do reconstructions through dendrochronology, we're seeing all the trees that survived, and so we're biasing that sample to some extent, and we don't have a great way of reconstructing early stand development and whether or not a plant is a competitor or a facilitator or somewhere in between. Likely it's a gradient and it's somewhere in between. So at this point, I'm thinking with this stand, our mortality was higher than I would like. We had more mortality for our planted seedlings. We had more mortality in our clear-cut gaps than we did in the matrix, which I think will be interesting to follow. But our average mortality, I can pull up the numbers, but it varied by species. Definitely the jack pine and the oaks actually survived the planting stress, the transplanting pretty well. The birch and the was kind of moderate on average, and the tamarack and the white pine actually were not so good. So I think less than 50% survived. So we'll have some questions. We'll have that question to answer as to whether or not we want to replant for the sake of the project, but also for the sake of making sure that we do trend this towards that diversified FDN 33 that we want.
We good? Are there other questions we should discuss?
I think this site is covered excellently. There is more info on Canvas, so folks feel
Right.
free to go there and check that out. But now is probably a great time for, say, a 15-minute break so we can walk to our next site and transition to thinking about fire and red pine.
That's right. So I've got 10:53 Central. So that would put us at about 8 minutes after the hour.
Let's
Look
say
for
10
that.
minutes
Yeah,
after that.
good idea. 10 minutes after the hour. Look for that live stream on the same place you found this one. All right. And keep questions and comments coming on Slido, but we'll talk to you in a few minutes.
Yay!